the last webinar in this year's Access the SFP series. My name's Amin and I'll be hosting the session today on the Personal Achievement Station, which is a key component of the SFP interviews. Before we begin, just want to give a shameless plug to please follow us on our Facebook and our new Instagram as well. You can also access a wealth of information on our website URL. We'll pop that in the chat as well. We'll be recording this webinar and uploading the recording on YouTube as well, in case you want to go back and watch this as well. So just a reminder to please complete our pre-course questionnaire if you've not already done it. We'll pop the link in the chat as well. This is really helpful for us because we'll be sending out a post-course questionnaire a few months down the line to see how we've been doing and compare the pre and post-course feedback to find out where we can improve. We will also be organising mock interviews and we'll send out a link for that at the end of this webinar. So please do take some time to fill that out as well. Feel free to type any questions in the chat box as we go along. Today I'm joined by my fellow committee members, Zaha, Hannah and Ross, who are going to be acting as moderators. They'll pick things up in the chat as we go along, and there'll also be opportunity at the end for Q&A to answer any further questions you guys might have. Okay. So just as an outline of this webinar today, let's get started. So in today's webinar, I'll be taking you guys through what you might expect in the personal station of the SFP interview. We'll be covering the type of questions you might get asked and how to prepare for these. And I'll also discuss some tips from my own experience and that of my peers as to how to show yourself off during this interview to really impress the interviewers. And we'll finish off, as I said, with a Q&A to mop up any questions you guys might have. Just a disclaimer that whatever we share today is obviously based purely on our own experiences. There's a whole range of questions you might get asked, this being the personal station. It's a little bit less structured than your critical appraisal and the clinical stations. But I hope to break the station down into manageable chunks and give a fairly detailed overview so you can prepare adequately and hopefully not have any big surprises on the day. We'll be covering quite a bit, but don't worry if you miss anything. As I said, this is being recorded as well. And yeah, Hannah, whenever you're happy to start the recording, we'll get going.
Yeah, we're recording.
Awesome, thanks. Okay, so just a little bit of background about myself. So I graduated from Cambridge this summer. Now I'm working as an academic F1 at Bart's Health Trust in Central and East London. I actually applied to both London and the Northwest Deaneries, which had quite different interview styles, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. My academic block will be in F2 and it's in primary care, so I'm quite excited about that because it's quite nice and broad and you can sort of tie it in with anything you might be interested in. So just as a little bit of an introduction to the personal station, I think it's important to just discuss a little bit about what it actually is. So the personal station is really just a chance for the interviewer to find out three things. Firstly, your personal attributes and qualities that make you a good candidate for the SFP. Secondly, your motivations and your past experiences that mean you have the correct attributes. And thirdly, how these experiences have helped your understanding of real-world academia. And when I say academia, I'm referring to research, leadership, management, teaching, whatever it is that you're going to be applying for. And essentially, they're just, they're trying to see if you're more than just a paper-producing robot. So think back to medical school interviews and the way you had to show off a holistic range of skills. It's pretty much a similar thing here as well. The personal station can be anything from up to one half of the interview, and the way it's structured can vary from deanery to deanery. So for instance, for my Northwest interview, the personal station made up one half, and the other half was the clinical station. In other deaneries, you may not have a specific dedicated personal station, and instead the questions might be integrated and interwoven into the interview as a whole. On the other hand, at my London interview, I didn't get asked any personal questions. So because it can be really so variable, the bottom line is that it's important to prepare for this station just as much as you would for the clinical and the critical appraisal stations. And in fact, this is the station where, you know, you can really set yourself apart from the crowd, because with the critical appraisal and the clinical stations, it's likely that people are going to say quite similar things to one another. But in this personal station, if you've got this at your in your deanery interview, you can really put your own unique spin on things and make sure the assessors really remember something that you've said. So I've divided the questions that you might get asked in the personal station into 4, and we'll look into these in a little bit more detail. So academic career and aspirations, research, teamwork and leadership, and teaching. So before we go into diving into these questions and how you might want to answer them, it's important to think about what are those attributes that I mentioned earlier that the assessors are looking for. So this little diagram is actually great because it really just summarizes what it means to be a medical expert. And I think it's a really helpful schematic to visualize the type of qualities an excellent academic clinician should have and an excellent SFP candidate. So it's a good summary to the type of attributes you're going to want to show off in the personal station. So it's definitely something to refer back to when you're preparing, and make sure you've got some examples for each of these 6 components. Also, having a bank of examples in your head for each of these components means you can draw upon them if you get asked a question you haven't actually prepared for. So some of you may have attended the previous fantastic webinars that we had on boosting your CV and writing white space questions. And to be honest, the personal station is really just a more verbal and interactive extension of this. So I'm not going to spend too much time lingering on the portfolio side of things because they've been covered quite extensively before. But I've just listed as a reminder the breadth of things that you can draw upon when you're preparing your answers for the personal station. So if you've not already done it, I'd recommend making a list of everything you've done during university that could fit into any of these categories. And then you can be in a better place to pick and choose what you want to focus on when you're prepping your answers. I think often we can get a little bit worried about the personal station because we feel we need to have loads of research and prizes. But the reality is that being selected for interview means the assessors who saw your application felt like they liked your application, they're interested in getting to know you further. And so you've already cleared the first hurdle. And even though it's extremely likely you'll have different assessors for your interviews to the ones who read your white space questions, it doesn't matter because essentially the personal station is just your chance to sell your experiences, no matter how many you have. So it's about quality and not quantity. And I think a good measure of quality is how much you have learned from the experience. So for example, the assessors would much rather hear about someone being part of a local small university society, but they were able to express, they learned skills like communication, collaboration, organization, rather than someone who on paper was on a much bigger society committee, but they weren't actually able to verbalize in the interview the impact of this on themselves. So this station is really all about verbalizing your learning and convincing the assessors that you've grown as a medical expert through your past experiences and that you're going to carry that on through to the SFP. So I'm sure you may be familiar with these frameworks, but I think it's always nice to just remind ourselves, in order to make sure that the answers that we're going to be prepping for the personal station are succinct, but also informative. So there's two frameworks. One is the STAR framework, and this is useful for when you're asked about a specific experience or you're giving a specific example. So S is for situation, so providing a background or a context. T is for task, so outlining what you set out to achieve. A is for action. So here you should be really specific about what your role was and what were the skills that you used or you developed. And R is for result. And then there's another R for reflection. To be honest, reflection is something you should do for all your answers, not just for star-based answers. So I think reflection is always something that always sounds a little bit vague, and nobody really knows what reflection means. At least I didn't know what it really meant to reflect. But in this turquoise box, I've just sort of bullet pointed a few things to think about when you're reflecting. So essentially, if you're mentioning you've gained or you've used a particular skill, what is the implication of this skill? Why is this skill important for the SFP? How is it transferable to your future as an academic clinician? So always remember to bring back your experiences, link them back to the SFP, and bring it home every time. The other framework to think about is CAMP. So this is good for questions about your background or where you see yourself in the future. So C is for clinical. So for example, is there a particular specialty you wish to pursue, a particular population you'd like to work with, a particular setting? So for instance, a district general hospital versus a tertiary centre, or city-based versus more rural. A is for academic, so this can be commitments like pursuing a full-time PhD or part-time academia. Is there a particular field of research or a lab that you want to get involved with, and why? M is for management, but also leadership and teaching. For example, is there, do you have a goal in mind to be involved in curriculum development to pursue a managerial position within the NHS? So it can be quite broad, this section. And then P is for personal. Now, obviously, this is the personal station. But when I mean personal here, it's sort of just something that is unique to you and kind of just shows that you've got other dimensions to you. It shows the human side to you, and that you're not just, you're not just about the clinical, the academic, all this supracurricular stuff. So I remember for my Northwest interview, for instance, I sort of mentioned that I would like to be closer to my family who are in the Northwest. And it was literally just a small comment at the end of my answer, but I think it just adds a nice personal touch and shows that there's a bit more to you as well. But of course, you should make sure that your answers focus predominantly on the C, A, and M rather than the P part. So now we'll dive into the questions themselves. So as the slides go on, I've listed a bunch of questions that I think, I'd really recommend that you guys go and prepare for and write some answers. As I said, I split the questions into 4 themes. So this is the first theme, academic career and aspirations. I've divided these questions further into red and blue. So the red ones are quite clearly asking you about yourself. And then the blue ones, they look like factual at first glance and like they're testing your knowledge. But actually, you should answer these questions by drawing upon your own personal experiences to inform your answers. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So if we just go through these, why do you want to complete an SFP? So it's likely you might have answered questions like this for your white space questions already. But think about it. Is there a particular motivation? Have you particularly enjoyed working on a project and you want to pursue this field further? Is the SFP going to be important as a springboard to achieving a long-term goal? For instance, allowing you to do a PG cert in medical education, or allowing you to attend particular courses that are going to help in improving your understanding of research methodology. So essentially have 2 to 3 reasons for why the SFP would be useful for your long-term goals in becoming a medical expert, really. Then is, why this foundation school? So you can use the CAMP framework for this quite nicely. Is there a particular tertiary centre in that deanery that you'd like to work in? Because it's a specialist centre for a particular service or specialty you're interested in. Is there a medical school that you're keen to work within and why, or a particular lab or researcher? And, even it doesn't matter what SFP you're applying for, it's always, if you're applying for research, you should still be thinking about management, teaching, and leadership. Similarly, if you're applying for teaching or leadership, you should still be thinking about research, because I think the two, or the 3 of them go hand in hand, and they're all based, they're all very much evidence-based activities. And then, as I said, think about P as well. So is it something you really like about the city, something personal to yourself? Now, with your answers, it's really important to make sure you're as specific as possible. And I've just listed some tips in this yellow box here as well. So be as specific as possible to yourself, to that specific deanery as well. Because it just shows the assessors that you've done your research, you've done your homework, and you're genuinely passionate about the prospect of working in that specific deanery. So it might be that for some of these questions, you'll have slightly different answers for one deanery and slightly different answers for the other deanery. Like you can have a couple of answers, just with different bits about each deanery added in. Then, thinking about career goals. So you could split this into immediate goals, midterm goals, and long-term goals. You could also split it into the CAMP framework. If they ask, what is your biggest weakness? When you're prepping this answer, I'd say prepare 2 weaknesses just in case. Don't pick something that would suggest you'd be an unsafe doctor, because first and foremost, they're looking for competent clinicians. However, most weaknesses can be framed in a positive way where you show you're working on it. And that goes to tip 2. So sandwich the negatives between positives. So for instance, for me, I remember saying in my Northwest interview that, so essentially my weakness was that I struggle with prioritizing and meeting deadlines sometimes. So I sort of framed it as, I can be very keen to take on lots of opportunities because I have high levels of motivation. However, this can result in struggling to manage time effectively. I've been working on this by X, Y, Z. So you're sort of sandwiching the negative bit between 2 positive bits, and then you're showing the assessors that you're constructively working on it as well. And then thinking about the blue questions. So this goes to tip 1. So questions might look outwardly personal, might not look outwardly personal, and they might just look very much factual, but try and link them to your prior learning and experiences. And we'll, for example, if they're asking you what is the job of a clinical academic, instead of just regurgitating, a list of activities, you can put a personal spin on it very simply by saying, you've spoken to SFP doctors, and higher academic trainees, you've spent time with them, and that has helped you to gain an insight and to be able to answer this question. So just sort of prefacing your answer with something like that immediately sets the tone that you're motivated and you're trying to find things out for yourself, rather than just Googling and then regurgitating a list that you found on Google. So I hope that makes sense. So this is a really busy slide. So as I said, webinar is being recorded, so do go back and rewatch as you need to. But this is part of an answer that I prepared for my personal stations to answer the question, what difficulties do you envisage during the SFP? And when you're preparing your answers, you can prepare in either note form or write it in prose. I used a bit of a mix, really. So essentially the turquoise box here highlights the key things you want to have in your answer. So firstly, a statement on, as I said before, how have you actually got the information to inform your answers is always a good way to start off and preface your subsequent answer by showing your motivation and showing what you've actively done. So you could say something like, I appreciate there are various difficulties that may come with an SFP through my previous experience speaking with doctors and myself juggling clinical placements and extracurricular commitments. And then you can go into the specifics as we talked about before. So you can pick 2 to 3 points that you'll give further specific detail on your previous experience and use the STAR framework to some extent for that. So I chose 2 points in my answer. So the first being that you have to achieve the same clinical competencies in the same time frame as your non-SFP colleagues, despite having less clinical time, because you've basically taken out one whole block of clinical time. And then the other difficulty was that 4 months isn't enough time to start from scratch a study and then complete it and publish it. So I'm not going to read this all out because you can read this afterwards in your own time. But one thing I just want to highlight is when I'm using the STAR framework and when I'm expanding on my experiences, I try to create like an explicit link between my past experience to the future and always link it back to the SFP. So, for example, for point number 1, I say what the difficulty could be, and then I say how I've been coping with that difficulty already, how I'm already, before I've even started the SFP, I'm trying to work on it. And therefore that's putting me in a better position to cope when I actually do the SFP. So, always link your past experience to the future and always link it back to the SFP. And that's something I'm going to keep drilling in because it's really important to just make sure you do that. Okay, so the next sort of theme of questions, if you like, is research. And these are questions that I think it would be worth spending some time thinking about and preparing for. So, for the question, what do you want to research? I would recommend having one idea for if you had an unlimited budget, and then one idea for if you had a realistic budget, for example, during an AFP. Or an SFP rather. So if you have a specific idea that you want to explore in a particular SFP, explain why and where you got that idea from as well. And when answering what you want to research, try and frame the answer using the PICO structure, which, if you're not already familiar with it, stands for population, intervention, comparison, and outcome. And then just mention at the end, why is this research question relevant and important? For example, is there a gap in the literature that's not been answered yet? Or is there going to be a really big impact on population health if this question gets answered? And again, you can also make it more personal by relating it to your previous experiences. So for example, you could say that you noticed XYZ problem during your clinical rotations and you realized it's something that hasn't been addressed before. And again, that's really nice touch because at the end of the day, you are meant to be, they're looking for someone who's going to make a good clinician in the first instance. So they would want to see that you're engaging in your clinical environment and you're picking up on the issues that you see on a day-to-day basis there, and that is providing the foundation for what you might like to do in research. So try and create that link between your clinical work and your sort of research or leadership or management aims as well. And so again, the questions here in blue, they don't look immediately personal, but again, you can reference your previous learning and experiences to answer these. And I've just put this slide in just because I felt it was quite fitting. This is a slide that you should hopefully become really familiar with as you prepare. I think it's important to be aware of the whole academic training pathway and how the specialized foundation program fits into this as well. And the fact that the SFP can be a really good springboard to access these higher stages of training. I think having that understanding means that you can sort of drop it into your answers as well in a very smooth and slick way. For example, when you're talking about your aims moving forwards. By dropping it in, it's showing the assessors that you've genuinely thought about the future and you've genuinely done your homework. Yeah, it just looks really slick and smooth. So for example, rather than just saying, I'd like to do a PhD in a few years' time, you can sort of reference this training pathway and say, I'd like to do a PhD in XYZ as part of an academic clinical fellowship after my SFP. So you're very just smoothly dropping it in, and it feels quite natural, and the assessors would appreciate that. So this is another example, something that part of an answer that I prepared for, to answer the questions about what are some key qualities that an SFP doctor should have. So I'm not going to read all of this out, but again, when you read back, you'll sort of see that I've tried to create a link between, so I state what the quality is. So for example, failing well and learning from failure. And then I sort of go on to mention how I've already begun to understand this and to experience this and develop this quality. And then I link it to the future and to the SFP. So again, it's about not just regurgitating a list, but making sure that you try and use the frameworks and always try and link your experiences to show what you've learned and how that can be applied to the future. Okay, so teaching is really important because there's no point learning all these skills and amassing all this new knowledge if you're not going to share it. So essentially, when you're, whether you're sharing your thoughts in a group meeting, or whether you're presenting or you're publishing, you're passing on new knowledge to others. And so, that is in itself kind of like, a type of teaching. So it requires good communication, the ability to gauge your audience and their needs. It doesn't matter whether you're applying for a teaching like an education SFP or not. It's a really important skill to have, and it's part of being a medical expert. So definitely worth some time being spent on preparing some answers for these 4 questions as well. And I think with being a medical student, you have a very unique position where obviously you're getting taught on a day-to-day basis, but you also may have experience of teaching your peers or teaching students in lower years as well. So you're in that unique position of understanding both sides of the coin. And I think that's something that should be reflected when you're preparing your answers for these sort of questions. Okay, and then the 4th category is leadership and teamwork. So again, I've listed a bunch of questions here and broken down into red and blue as well. And it's worth spending some time preparing for these as well. I won't go through each of these one by one, but I will say, and I do have an example on the next slide for the top question. But something that I came across when I was preparing for the personal station was this concept of clinical governance. I had no idea what it was actually, and then I came across this, and essentially it's worth looking into what it is, because you could easily be asked this in a personal station. They might just want to test your understanding of it. So clinical governance is basically an overarching term for a range of activities that clinicians should be involved in as part of maintaining and improving the quality of care that you provide. So there's 7 pillars to it, which include things like audit, involving the patient and the public, things such as research as well, and education. You don't need to know a lot about it, but it's just a handy tip, because I remember some of my peers were asked, questions about clinical governance in their interviews. And I think it's handy to just have an idea of it. And again, to have some own personal experiences of being involved in aspects of clinical governance, even though you're a med student. So on the next slide, we've got another example. So this is an example that I prepared for describing leadership experience. So I picked one example, because it's better to have one example and flesh it out fully, rather than having a bunch of scattered examples, and you're not going into depth in each of them. So again, I won't read this all out, because you can go back and watch this and pause it. But if you remember at the start, I talked about this, the medical expert schematic, and to sort of tick off each of those 6 components when you're drafting your answers. And that's kind of what I've tried to do here. So, in the red are kind of the skills that I'm ticking off in my head as I'm preparing this answer. So I'm making sure that within my answer, I've mentioned skills such as communication, understanding different people's skill sets, delegating, task prioritizing. Like, these are really important buzzwords. And I think if you go back to webinar 4 by Zaha, which was on white space questions, there's some really nice there's a really nice slide with some buzzwords on there. So it's really handy to just pop these in as well, and make sure that in your answer you're ticking off as many skills of the medical expert as possible. So just some general tips. As I said, have 2 to 3 points per answer, use the frameworks, and always mention what have you learned from your experiences, and how is that going to help you as a doctor, and as furthermore as an SFP candidate. I'd say practice your answers with friends and use different interviewing styles. And then in terms of, so my interviews were all online last year, and I assume that I've gathered that most of them are going to be online this year as well. For me, I was quite nervous about having online interviews, so I'd really recommend practicing with your friends online as well, and try and just get comfortable with things like making sure you look into your camera rather than at the screen or at yourself, because it's kind of basically it's a virtual way of making eye contact. Ensure good lighting. Think about what your background's going to be like. Have all of these things sorted out before the day of the interview, so you're not panicking on the day. Even simple things like if you're in university halls, like I just put a sign outside my door the day before, saying do not disturb, and like things like that. Just make sure that you've got your preparation sorted before the interview, so the day is as stress-free as it can be. And yeah, this is just, I guess, a summary of the key points that I've sort of touched upon and tried to emphasize during this webinar. And yeah, the pictures are just for the STAR and the CAMP frameworks. So I think now yeah, we'll go into the Q&A. If anyone's got any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, and one of the moderators can pick it up. I can't actually see the chat myself, but happy to answer any questions people might have.
We don't have any questions so far. So we have a question which isn't necessarily regarding the talk, but just asking how we access recordings from previous sessions. So do you just want me to say?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So the recordings will all be available on our YouTube channel, essentially. The recordings have been a bit sort of slow to upload, and apologies for that. It's only because we've been quite busy with our rotations and things, but so far I think most of the recordings are on there, and this recording will also go on there as well, so they should be on our YouTube channel.
And yeah, I would definitely recommend, going back and sort of revisiting concepts. The previous webinars will be really great as well in helping prepare for the interviews. And we'll give it another minute, and if we don't have any more questions, then we can move on to the feedback and the mock interview signups.
So we have a question from Rachel, who's asking whether you could briefly outline the structure of the 7 interviews again, if you already didn't mention that, or if you're in the know at all.
The 7 interviews.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, what do you mean by the 7 interviews?
7. So the deanery, so Bristol.
7. Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah. So I didn't apply to 7. So I applied to London and Northwest. So with Northwest, it was one half of the station. One half of the interview was the personal station, asking questions very similar to what we've gone through today, and the other half was clinical. And then for London, it was one half was the clinical station, and then one half was critical appraisal. I'm not sure if you guys want to chip in about your deaneries, feel free.
So we do have 2 committee members who are based in Bristol, and there are co-chairs essentially called Antonio and Maya, who aren't here today, but if you do sort of want to find them on Facebook, drop them a message, and they should be able to sort of guide you if you want to know specifically about the 7 interviews. They can't join us unfortunately today, so and I don't think any of us actually applied to 7 or got through to the interview, so we won't be able to help with that. I think also just to share, I think I'm based in Sheffield and I'm doing the medical education project, and with the MedEd project, with the SFP interview, for me, which was quite generic, so it was also for research as well. So when I was sort of doing my interview, wasn't necessarily just for medical education, it was for just the AFP, and it was pretty much like a 10-minute interview online, had 2 stations. Again, one was personal and one was the academic. The academic was, they just give you, again, very similar, give you a STEM that you need to talk through about management, and you usually just use your ABCD approach. So essentially just practice with friends, and that's quite helpful to do that. And then personal, obviously, Eamon's covered it in good detail. And it's pretty much the same kind of questions in terms of, you know, asking about your previous experiences, having a good understanding of the SFP route, possible career progression and where you want to see yourself, and how you're just going to manage your workload, which Eamon's all covered, but that was just Sheffield.
So yeah, I'd recommend like just with your deaneries, try and find out what, you know, once you've sort of, you know, try and find out about what their structure is. And if they don't give you much detail, I mean, as I said, don't neglect the personal station. You know, it's really important to prepare for it. And yeah, so you're not surprised on the day if they do ask any of these questions. Yeah, if there's no other questions, I think we'll move on to the feedback and mock interview sign-ups. So yeah, if you guys wouldn't mind filling out the feedback for this session, that would be fantastic. And yeah, just let us know if there's any problems accessing it. And then on the next slide, we'll have the mock interview sign-ups as well, which will be first come, first serve. So I'll just pause a few seconds here. If it's in the chat, if you guys wouldn't mind popping it in the chat as well, that'd be great.
So I'll just resend it in the chat.
Thanks.
Oh, sorry, I've just directly messaged me. There we go.
So we'll just give it a few seconds, then I'll just move to a final slide. Okay, and yeah, this is the sign-up form for our mock interviews, which we're hoping will be running over the next couple of months. So do feel free to sign up as well, and you'll get an interview with a current SFP doctor, and we'll try to match it with the type of SFP or the type of the deanery that you're planning on applying to as well. So we'll try and keep it relevant for you. Okay, so I think if there's no other questions, we'll call it a day, or call it an evening even. So thank you guys for tuning in today. Again, as ever, if you have any questions, do feel free to drop us an email or message us on Facebook or Instagram as well. And we'll send out further details about the mock interviews once we've got everyone's places confirmed.